Good evening. Can everyone hear me? It's on. It's on already. I turn it. Test? No, you can't hear it, right? Can you hear me? No, it's on already. Right. Oh. Oh, I can hear it. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the July Special Board of Education meeting. Before we start the meeting, can everyone stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please? Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. The board toured the facilities on July 23rd, and this is going to be the first of many meetings that we will have regarding facilities. The board is always cognizant about the district's finances, and the one of the mission statements for the district states that a safe and secure physical plant that supports cutting edge instruction through continuous improvements, and we are working towards that as well. Before we start, I just want to keep everyone informed that we will be speaking about 3 areas today, and that's going to be the building conditions survey. The second one is going to be the enrollment data, and the last one is going to be the process, how we are going about to achieve the goal that we have. And before we start, Dr. Rogers is going to give us a brief presentation on the board tour that we had, as well as combining the presentation we had at the June meeting. And at the June meeting, the presentation is posted on the district website. It has some preliminary numbers, but this is only the very, very beginning. So that number is going to change. So keep in mind that number is going to change as we talk more about into this process. All right. So Dr. Rogers, is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. So as Ms. Cheng said, the board had the opportunity to go, as they did last summer, through our facilities. I'm going to do a quick recap of that and kind of update us on where we're at. Our last conversation about this was at the June Board of Education meeting. At that meeting, our architects and engineers from H2M presented the visual inspection, the building condition survey of the school buildings to the board. And the board asked the architects to come back with a prioritization of those projects. Obviously, not all of the work that will eventually need to be done needs to be done immediately. So they are working on that, and I anticipate having that for the board at the regularly scheduled August 28th meeting. So just to kind of recap the work that the board has been doing over this past year, members of the board did tours of comparable facilities in neighboring school districts in Jericho and Hicksville, looked at features of those facilities like the pool, the gym, the auditorium, the cafeteria. We had a workshop discussion in January to try and frame out some goals around facilities. We did do a tour last summer on 2 different dates, and then again this summer. Over the course of 2 years, not possible to do a deep dive and hit all 10 buildings, but a lot of the challenges that exist in the buildings exist in similar ways in other buildings. So if you see the same kind of cracked wall in one building, you don't need to go see it in all the buildings. You kind of know cracked walls have to be fixed, non-structural cracks to be specific. We did in the winter go through an enrollment projection. I'll have some updates on that tonight. And then, as I said, that in June, we went through the building condition survey. Just have a brief summary of the discussion that occurred when the board had the workshop back in January. And to amplify the district goal that Ms. Cheng just shared, the board is talking about being good stewards of the district's facilities. Obviously, we want them to be safe, inviting for children, and we want them to support the learning that children are doing and recognize that that learning is changing over time. And so we want those facilities to support not just the curriculum that is in place for today, but the curriculum that we anticipate our students might need to learn tomorrow. So we made a number of stops in the facilities. Altogether, the district has about 1 million square feet of facility space under management. So again, lots of spaces to see, not possible to get to everything over the course of 2 years. The last 2 summers at the high school, the board saw the family and consumer science classrooms, the auditorium, the gymnasium, and talked about some of the constraints and limitations on the gymnasium space here. There's a student courtyard that is in need of some attention. Our tech classrooms have seen growing enrollment, as has our robotics classroom. Many of the bathrooms we did in the phase 2 facilities, a lot of bathroom work district-wide. There's still plenty more to be done. The locker rooms and the bathrooms are essentially in the same condition that they've been in for many decades. We're working right now to try and digest some of our enrollment growth by converting a large storage space into a usable classroom that will help us go +1 on classrooms. One won't be enough, but it's certainly a start. We've talked about some of the challenges with busing and trying to alleviate some of the pressure on Southwoods Road and the traffic congestion that arrival and dismissal cause. So we've talked about the possibility of a second bus egress from the high school, and many school districts are co-locating mental health and social services supports for children in a single location. And we talked about what might be necessary to accomplish that at the high school. At each of the 2 middle schools, again, family consumer science rooms, gymnasium, locker room spaces. Some of the electrical infrastructure is original to the buildings, and so it's still in very good condition and has been well maintained, but we would like to upgrade it before it reaches the end of its useful life. And as with any property, there's attention that's needed to site work, the parking lots, the curbs, potential trip hazards, that sort of thing. And there are some metal outdoor canopies, and those have weathered well, but they won't weather indefinitely, and so they need some attention. And we talked about some of the differences and a lack of comparability between some of the opportunities that exist at Southwoods because it's on the same campus as the high school that don't exist at Thompson, specifically a dedicated field and track so that students are able to practice things like baton relays if they're on the track team. We've stopped at several of the facilities. The board toured all of the facilities, but in 2 different venues. The board does an instructional tour in the spring and visits all 7 elementaries. We did deep dives at 3 of the 7 elementaries looking at facilities issues. The issues there are common to all of the buildings. Any of the buildings that have what are known as portables are those portables are aging and in need of replacement. Again, they've not reached the end of their usefulness to us, but we want to plan ahead for what their successor will be and have a thoughtful transition from the current space to the future space. And there's going to need to be, in many cases, some overlap. In a couple of the buildings, Berry Hill and Walt Whitman in particular, the buildings are tight from an enrollment perspective. They've grown, and so we'll need some additional space to access it. There are some problems with ADA access because of the topography of the Berry Hill campus that we would like to give some attention to. And in all of the buildings, we are thinking about cafeteria space, kitchen space. They are built from another time when that was not a priority. Obviously, this is socialization space, and there's the opportunity to prepare food on site as opposed to satelliting the food in from the secondary schools, which would be an advantage if it was possible to do. I keep this chart in because I think it's really illustrative. The height of the bar represents the amount of square footage, and then the square footage is grouped by decades. And you can see nearly all of the square footage in the district was built in the 1950s, with some modest additions ever since. So all of that infrastructure is reaching the 70-year mark essentially simultaneously. So why so much now? Well, because they're all aging together, unfortunately. And the district did go through a period where investment in the facilities was at a minimum. And so now we're making up for some of the investment that was not done then, but it needs to be done now. I mentioned that I'll have a little bit of an update on enrollment growth. This is the existing chart that shows the change in enrollment over time since 2019. The point of the chart being that there's a bubble at the elementary level that is projected at least to subside. That bubble will then move through the middle schools and then subside, and eventually that bubble will reach the high school. So accommodating that growth, particularly at the middle and high schools, is going to be the challenge that confronts the administration and the board over the next several years. In the elementary schools, 3 of the elementary schools, South Grove, Robbins Lane, and Bayless, are projected to remain roughly constant in terms of their enrollment. But the 2 buildings I mentioned previously that have experienced recent growth and are tight are Berry Hill and Walt Whitman. They're both projected to have a bubble that subsides, but I think we need to plan for the possibility that the bubble doesn't subside. So that's, certainly front of mind for me. And then we have some elementary schools that are projected rather, to lose some enrollment over time. And again, these are projections, so certainly no guarantee, and we wouldn't want to decommission space that the district might eventually need. So as I said, we've been watching enrollment closely this summer. And so the question, on my mind is how well have our projections held up so far? And for the most part, they've held up well. There are 3 buildings where the projections are 3 elementary buildings where the projections are essentially dead on. And in the remaining 4 buildings, the projections were more conservative, or another way of putting it is more aggressive in terms of growth than what has materialized so far. I will say the caveat on all of this is that we're only halfway through the summer, and summer is typically where we see the most enrollment, as summer is the time when families would want to move, not during the school year. So it wouldn't surprise me to see those numbers inch up a little bit over the course of the remaining month of summer. But I do think that it's indicative, at least trend-wise, that we're either on projection or below projection. At the secondary level, the projections are not nearly as volatile for a couple of reasons. Families try not to move once their kids are in secondary schools and have formed a lot of friendships and relationships. And because the buildings are just larger, as a natural function of statistics, they tend not to be as volatile. And here the projections have held up extraordinarily well. So looking into the future, as I mentioned, we'll continue to keep a close eye on the accuracy of the projection. I do think that the environment is different now with remote work trends, and those remote work trends also appear to be evolving. So I think we'll have to stay attentive to that evolution. And certainly it's hard to drive around Syosset and not notice that there's still quite a bit of residential construction going on. And so I think we'd be wise if we're going to go through a period of doing some construction to make sure that we add enough capacity so that we're not worried that we might run out of capacity at some point in the future. So in the June presentation, we kind of focused on things that were in the first 2 columns and promised that we would come back and focus on things that are in the next 2 columns. And in the board tours, we did talk about this enrollment challenge, particularly at the high school that we're going to see. The limitations that we have on the amount of space for student athletics, the constraints on the robotics program because of the size of the space that it's in. And although we did renovate quite a few science classrooms at the secondary level in the last bond project, we didn't get to all of them. So there's certainly still more work to be done there. And as I mentioned, this idea of co-locating mental health services for students is something that is being pursued by a lot of school districts. We've just finalized our partnership with Northwell Health to support our mental health services for students. So we're looking to get into that partnership starting this fall. So we're thinking with them about some of the best practices that they've observed in districts that are already partnering with them. At HBT, it's a large building that has a very small security vestibule. We think the function of the building could be improved by giving that some attention. It would make a more welcoming way for visitors to come to the building, but it would also make it more secure by having that be just a larger space between the doors. And then lastly, we talked about hypothetically what would be involved in adding elementary kitchens. There's no building that really has the square footage within the existing footprint to do it, so it would require adding on to. And then all the other things that are on here, the fuel tank, parking, playground upgrades, these are always attractive to school districts and necessities as old equipment ages and needs to be replaced and improved. So I was asked to just share a little bit about the process for large construction projects like this in school districts. This isn't intended to be exhaustive. It's intended to be just an overview. But to think about a timeline, obviously we're right now in the first couple of lines of this table, having done a presentation on the facilities repair needs that the architects have identified. We've gone through now some work touring the facilities. The goal would be to put together public presentations that we can share with the public generally as the board starts to identify its priorities and finalizes a scope of work. Because of the size of this, smaller projects, the district can declare itself what's called a type 2 lead agency, meaning it's a type 2 action, and there's less environmental review that's necessary for smaller projects because they're less impactful. But several of the projects that are under consideration here, the portable construction, reconstruction into something more permanent, will undoubtedly exceed the size. So we'll have to do some type 1 environmental reviews that will take time. And then ultimately the time frame between the board deciding on what the final scope of work will be and having a public referendum is a minimum of 45 days. During that 45-day period, as we've done in the past, we'll hold extensive amounts of public engagement, meetings with members of the community, members of the district staff, and members of the parent community. And then at some point, a date will be set for the bond referendum. Assuming the referendum is successful, then the architects will take the conceptual drawings and start to turn them into real drawings. Wouldn't make sense to invest the work that's necessary to do that if the project wasn't approved, or if the documents needed to be amended in order to get the project approved. But once that occurs, there will be a period of time where they're working and sending the final documents up to the department. Unlike when you build a residential construction and you get a building permit from, let's say, the town or the village, school districts get their building permits from the state education department. There is a lot of school construction going on right now, and the department has been experiencing some staffing constraints. So what that means is that there's a lot of lead time involved in getting approval from the state education department. So for some modest projects, it might be as short as 5 months, but for more substantial projects, it's wise to plan on more like 10 months. Then we're a public employer, we're a public entity, so we have to go through a public bidding process, and we have to award to the lowest responsible bidder. So we go through that bidding process. Obviously, we try to have enough detail in the construction documents so that it would be difficult for a low bidder to find a place to cut a corner. And then we'll go through a contract award phase. And once contracts are awarded, we go through a phase where we are working with the contractor to ensure that they have the right bonds and insurances to work with us. Syosset is a stickler for bonds and insurances. That's not universal in the school world, but that's something that we think is very important. And then if all of this moves along quickly, the likely first major construction season would be the summer of 2025. And then just a little bit on how schools are financed. The state shares in the cost of school construction for instructional space. So when we use this term approved costs, there are things that the state will allow: instructional space and then ancillary support space to that instructional space. Not everything will be approvable, and it is typical that when you do construction of a building, that there's some percentage, maybe 80–85% of the building that's approvable, and 15% of it, even though you couldn't build the building without it, won't necessarily receive state financial assistance. What's interesting about this fact is that when I arrived in 2014, the state's aid ratio, that's the proportion that the state would kick in, was only 16%. That has increased over the last 9 years. It's now 42%. So I feel like we're at something of a high water mark in terms of state financial assistance, and probably an opportune time to take advantage of that because it's higher than it's ever been here in Syosset. So certainly we'd want the state to help us defray whatever costs we have. We also try to avoid borrowing where possible. So we put in this last round of construction, we did a lot of construction through the district budget, through both the maintenance budget and what's called transfer to capital. And by doing so, we've avoided any interest costs that the district might incur, and done a lot of this work on sort of a year-to-year basis. But ultimately, when you're talking about large amounts of construction, you'll have to do some borrowing. We did do borrowing on the last round of construction, and through a couple of quirks in how the bond market worked, literally on the day that we were purchasing our bonds, we got some incredibly favorable bond rates, like 2% mortgages for 20 years. So we did very well the last time around. Obviously, interest rates are not nearly that low right now. So on the one hand, interest rates are higher. On the other hand, the state's assistance has never been higher. And then in the past, and we still have some remaining capital reserves, the more we pledge our capital reserves to the work that has to be done, again, the less borrowing we have to do. And certainly that's even more attractive now, considering how high interest rates are. So just to kind of sum up the cost equations, it is a little bit of a teeter-totter. On the plus side, we have the state aid never being more generous than it is now. On the minus side, we've seen inflation in the construction marketplace. The costs have gone up in some cases in startling ways. Supply chains have been really challenging in several different subsets of the construction world, and lead times for equipment, I'm thinking of like air conditioning equipment, the lead times are just extraordinary, half a year, maybe more. So as we look in the future and we realize it'll take time to get to work on all of this, interest rates will hopefully continue to come down. Inflation will also hopefully continue to come down. And if that is reflected in construction costs and maybe some easing of the supply chain constraints in the 2 years until we're able to really get started, hopefully we'll see some easing on some of those cost pressures without any relaxing on the state aid reimbursement that we get. But those are all unknowns and things that we'll have to watch and track closely over the course of the next couple of years. So I hope, Ms. Cheng, that sets the stage for the conversation the board was hoping to have.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Rogers? Ms. Emerson?
I guess my first question is, in 2025, if you can break grounds in 2025, where would the bubble, I didn't see where the bubble would be at that point. Would it be like middle or high school? Or is it still in elementary? And I remember when we were talking about purchasing Stillwell, we looked at debt being retired and turning those over into new debt. Is that possibilities for us for any of these projects or the majority of these projects?
Yeah, two good questions. So the bubble is already moving through elementary schools, although two are tight. So we'll still need to address that. The other 5 schools, it's less about adding space and more about turning over the portables that have sort of reached the end of life and need to be replaced with something more substantial and permanent. The middle schools, HBT appears to be at the top of its bubble, but a bubble is still coming at Southwoods. So we've been looking at options within the school footprint for space that is currently purposed as administrative space that might be repurposed into classroom space and reclaim that space. The high school, I think we've scavenged as much space from the existing physical plant of the high school as possible. And so we would need to expand the footprint of the high school in one way or another. The point about retiring old debt is a good one. The project for Stillwell was going to be in the neighborhood of $10 million. And so the amount of debt that was being retired was roughly comparable to what the debt service on that amount of money would be. So certainly we would take advantage of that debt roll off to blunt the impact of whatever new debt we would incur. And the way I kind of framed this the last time when we were explaining the last bond that we did was, I said, it's like having two kids that are 4 years apart. When one kid graduates from college, you stop paying that tuition payment, but the other one just became a freshman. So you still have a tuition payment. It's a new tuition payment because it's a new kid, but from a family budget perspective, it feels like the same thing. So we would take advantage of the debt roll off in the same way. We would borrow and replace that debt. And I'll go a little bit into the weeds. We wouldn't do a big financing up front. Instead, what happens is we do lots of small financings, just enough money to pay for whatever bills are in front of us with the construction we have. And then and those are called bond anticipation notes. And then when we have quite a bit of that, we'll roll it into a permanent 20-year bond. And that's done for a couple of reasons. It minimizes the amount of money that you've borrowed and therefore minimizes the amount of interest that you're paying at any given time. And it also helps the district stay within state rules that forbid us from doing arbitrage on bond proceeds. So for two reasons, we do this sort of multi-step process for borrowing.
Mr. Ostrich?
Sure, thank you. Can I just make a suggestion? There's a lot of topics to potentially cover in a lot of different areas. Could we follow Dr. Rogers' presentation in terms of the order of grouping questions in general categories, the BCS visual inspection, then sort of future growth and, the three stages that he showed. That way, I feel like if we can group the questions in similar areas, it'll stop us from going in a lot of directions at once.
Sure, that's fine.
What?
Okay. Do you have a question on the BCS?
I have a couple, but I don't want to monopolize the mic, so go ahead first.
All right, so we can go with the first part, which is the building conditions survey. Anyone with questions on that? The first part? Mr. Greco?
Real simple, Dr. Rogers. So the AVI, and I know there was a sort of an enhanced AVI this year, and the BCS will get in the spring of 2024. Is there anything, I mean, what can we expect? What is the real difference between those? Obviously, I know the BCS is every 5 years, but technically, what's going to be in this that's useful to us that we're waiting on?
The whole point of doing an enhanced visual inspection this year was so that there wouldn't be any surprises in the BCS. My impression was that the board wanted to get to work on the facilities as quickly as possible. And so we took advantage of the annual visual inspection to essentially preview what we would get in the BCS. So it is certainly possible that we might encounter something that wasn't discovered this time around, and we would certainly add that to the scope of work. But the point of doing the enhanced visual inspection was to essentially parallel the process for the BCS next year.
Sure. So Dr. Rogers, the BCS and the AVI, I'll for simplicity's sake, I'll just group them together. The expectation is that the recommendations for those projects, the $88 million of maintenance and improvements existing in the buildings, was to be completed over the next 5 years with a priority list in terms that is being worked on in terms of what's the highest priority in terms of time, et cetera. So I have a couple of questions along a couple of dimensions of that. So first off, there are a number of the recommendations in the 88 million that are a little bit more cosmetic related. So when we are considering those projects that might not be as safety related, how much leeway do we have in terms of putting those in transfer to capital as opposed to budgets, even if they're more expensive, and extending that time frame instead of doing it over 3 to 5 years, doing it over 3 to 7 years? Things like bathrooms or science casework rooms or locker rooms or things like that, bathroom renovations. That's one sort of series of, we'll go back and forth.
Yeah, I anticipate, and our architects are here, and if I can formulate a question, I'll have them answer as well. But I anticipate that what we'll get in August is going to be exactly that, that there are things that are not necessarily health and safety concerns, but that are tied to outdated codes or antiquated that we would like to update. Certainly, we want to see the quality of the facilities look good, but improving the finishes in a bathroom is not as important as making sure that our electrical infrastructure doesn't fail on us, for example. So, right, there are some things that, and I'm not saying this is your characterization, my characterization, things that might initially appear cosmetic, but they could lead to further erosion of the building infrastructure. And so I'm thinking of repointing the brick on the exterior. We don't want water to get behind the brick and force the brick off the building. So, and we would consider that it's a cosmetic improvement that has a functional need. And I'm anticipating that as we go through that prioritization, we'll find that those finishes and cosmetic things will be the lowest priority. And then the conversation for the board is, when do you want to get to those things? And are they the highest priority to get to in the first, let's say, 3 years, or would we push them into a future conversation that's a couple of years off as we come to the end of one project and decide how much you want to take on in the next? And that is the process that occurred 5 years ago. These are the same bathrooms that we looked at 5 years ago. And so we tackled some of them, but not all. And we had a kind of a rubric that we used for trying to decide how many to do in each building and get some of them moving, but not tackle them all at once.
Another thought that I had, or question that I had, is within the prioritization of the BCS AVI reporting, can we also see next to the health and safety whether or not it's going to be subject to reimbursement, state aid, or whether or not that's in terms of another dimension to evaluate the priority list?
We have Megan Bellato and Kevin Medler from H2M here. I'm just going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, one of you taking the question off the top of your head. All of the health and safety work, I believe, would be state reimbursable. Is that correct? Okay. For the benefit of those watching this on the stream, they said they think so, but they'd like to give us a more definitive answer. But that would be my assumption as well. Typically, what's not aidable is projects that are not related to instructional space or non-instructional spaces in an instructional building. But if it's an instructional building and it's part of the infrastructure of the building, my understanding is that that would be aidable space.
I just had one more question. So within the capital budget, every year, it's roughly 15% of the budget. Do we have a sense of how much room these transfer to capital projects are each year? In other words, so if, let's say I think we identified $23 million of non-bonded projects that we want to try and tackle over the period of time that's related to the AVI reporting. Within the context of the 15% that's capital every year, that 23 million is projected to stretch 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. I just don't have a sense of what part of capital budget is already fixed and accounted for, and what part is sort of discretionary for additional projects like this.
So typically what we'll do is have some short range plans and some long range plans. So we have, and it's easier to describe this in hindsight than to describe it moving forward because we haven't settled on some decisions around things. But with the last round, what we knew was there was a lot of roofing work that needed to be done in the district. So we identified the roofs that were in the worst shape of all, and they were the highest priority of all, and started working through a multi-year use of this transfer to capital to attack roofs and some other projects around the district. So the way we've approached transfer to capital is At the end of the year, if there is an operating surplus from the district, some of that money is plowed back into the subsequent year's budget to try and reduce the tax rate. And the remaining is either put into reserves or put into transfer to capital. So we're using that end of year surplus to pay for the next year's capital budget, if that makes sense. So some of this is constrained by how the year winds up, how much money is free at the end of the year, and some of it is constrained by what projects are available. So there might be a high priority project that would be just too much money for what we had available to do in transfer to capital. So that might slide down a year, and some smaller project might take its place, even if it wasn't quite as high a priority. So it's triangulating between those two factors, how much is available and what's our highest priority. So I do think that when Dr. Rufo, Mr. Hamilton, and I went through the projects that we thought could be handled through the district's budget, that we had a sense of projects that were not so broad in scope that there would never be enough money in transfer to capital to address them. And they weren't competing with other existing priorities so that it was unreasonable to think that we would get to them. So that number was intended to be a realistic number of things that we could get to over the next 5-6 years.
Okay, so the idea would be a plus or minus $4 million a year in the annual budget. So stretching over the next 4 to 6 million, whatever it is, to get to the $24 million amount.
Right, of which some might be transferred to capital and some might be in the maintenance budget and scattered in other places. The facilities team has a budget, so they're identifying paving projects that need to be done as part of their budget. So it won't all be in transfer to capital, but it will be in various different lines in the budget.
Right. I wasn't necessarily speaking about transfer to capital so much as the capital section. I'm just thinking in my mind, right? It's $40 million, 15% of the budget per annum. How much of that is thought to be dedicated to these projects each year of that 15%? So if it's 4 million a year of that 40 million, then it's scheduled to take 6 years. But if it's going to vary each year is what you're saying.
Mr. Greco?
So when we get to the point where we're attempting to prioritize some of these items, obviously we have, safety as one bucket, and then we have what you called cosmetic as sort of the final bucket. And then there's, of course, things that could be somewhere in the middle, like the repointing you mentioned. So when I looked at your last presentation, you mentioned paving, and there was a $4.7 million number for paving. And obviously some paving and sidewalks is 100% safety, but some may not be. So when we get to the point of starting to make a list of these priorities, can that be broken down in a way where the portion of that $4.7 million that is truly safety could be separated from, I hate to use the word cosmetic, but what is essentially cosmetic?
We can certainly stratify the levels of need and that's what I was anticipating that H2M would give us as they were going through that. There will be places where small repairs now will avoid large repairs later. So we'll want to think about, spending money up front to spare ourselves some larger investments down the road. Certainly some of the paving and site work issues are matters of safety because there are the pavement has become uneven in places, and so we don't want that to become a trip hazard. And some of the parking lots will have issues with ponding and other kinds of things. So not addressing the water problems leads to other kinds of problems. So they may not be in necessarily bad shape, but there may be reasons why it's worth tackling them. But with all of these projects, what I envisioned from the board's conversation in June, what we've been working on is trying to come up with a realistic plan of what are the absolute highest priorities, what are on the list, but maybe not the highest priority, or maybe things that we want to think about in phases that wouldn't earn their way into the first phase.
Ms. Abramson?
sorry, last question. Are there, in terms of what you're saying with the prioritization with the 4.7 and like, is it an economies of scale question also? Like if you are repaving and we have all the machinery and we have and we're buying it, is it more cost effective to do those projects in bulk for the district? If we're buying portables, does it make more sense to buy them in bulk for the district? Are those things that exist in these in this type of projects?
For that, I'm going to turn to either Megan or Kevin, and if one of you wouldn't mind just answering the question from the microphone. I have seen both things that are bid separately because you're trying to drive more competition, and I've seen things where if you put a bigger project out there, you get bigger contractors interested, and so it may depend on the type of project. So this is Kevin Medler from H2M.
Yes, there is an economy to scale. Oh, hold on. Loud enough. Can you hear me now? So yes, there is, and it depends on the project, but also as Dr. Rogers said, what you also get are contractors that want those projects, so they will put in better prices depending on the type of project that it is and how big that project is. If you have a bunch of small projects, yes, most contractors will not put prices in, and you'll get a few that will put larger numbers in, and you'll get the better numbers if you have that larger project that contractors want to bid on. So not only is it a material thing and a mobilization, demobilization cost that's associated with doing multiple projects as opposed to one big project, but it's also that you have contractors a little more hungry to get that better project.
So is it fair to say that larger projects have the potential to be more profitable to the larger contractors, and therefore they are interested in bidding on it because they can have all of their personnel working on something and they kind of get one stop and they've got their work set up for the summer and they don't have to think about sending people to multiple different project sites and having lots of mobilization costs in different places?
Typically, yes. And a lot of times with the smaller project, you'll have contractors that aren't really out there doing those types of projects. So the better contractors want that larger project in order to again keep their forces busy.
Now, something like Ms. Abramson mentioned, the portable reconstruction to something more permanent, because that would exist on multiple different campuses. Is that something that you would envision trying to package as a single project, or would you package each campus as a separate project? Just from a pricing perspective, is there any advantage?
I don't think you really get that savings with that. They would still have to mobilize separate teams for that. So I personally, I would say package those as separate projects per campus.
And for something like site work, where you might gang the job at one campus and then move the gang to another campus and gang the job at a second campus, is that the kind of thing that you would recommend we bid out as multiple campuses, or would you bid out each campus individually?
The problem with that is if you have the same company doing multiple campuses, if somehow they get hung up on one, it just delays the project on the next and the next and the next. And not only that, the question is, do they have the forces in order to accomplish all that with the manpower within their company? And a lot of companies, what we don't want is a company to get that job or get that project, hire on quick. This way you have people that haven't been working there long doing that work. So you want the right company in there to make sure that they have the skill set in order to do so and not overtax their labor force.
Okay. And just to kind of round out the question, can you think of any other recommendations that you would give the board, the administration, for how we would package this work to try and achieve as many economies of scale as possible?
I think trying to localize everything and get as much as we can accomplish. So as Dr. Rogers was saying, the way we approach this is safety first. That's the first thing we look at when we prioritize those projects. Second is we're looking to the future. So as Dr. Rogers said, roofs. Let's just use that as an example. We're looking to get ahead of that so you don't have that critical failure at one point. So if we can package a whole bunch of those in one project, then that would be the most ideal, because not only do you have to do that over the course, but if we have a contractor that's able to manage really a multitude of scopes, that would be the best way to package it. This way you get one contractor responsible for it all, and we can really take care of a few of those items at one clip.
So we understand, so it's by site that really matters. If we can do multiple projects at one location, is that the best way to package it? I
That
just
would
want to
be.
make sure I understand.
No, it absolutely on one site would be the most ideal way of doing it.
Any other questions on BCS? All right, then we,
Call you back.
all right, now we're moving on to the enrollment. Okay, Mr. Greco, please.
So Dr. Rogers, I've been probably spending too much time trying to digest these projections, and we continue to talk about a bubble, and maybe I'm just seeing it differently, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see this bubble happening. So putting aside elementary school, because that bubble seems to be here, and it's now an issue of the individual schools, not elementary as a whole. The middle school bubble seems to peak, and these are all projections, in around 2027, but then drop off quickly again, where we're looking at only a couple of years at capacity. But it's the high school bubble that seems to start, and I use 2,500 children, kids as the number I use for where I see the bubble. That's around 2028, and that does not appear to peter off. And it may be because a lot of the projections are going only until 2032, I believe. So is that your understanding of how we're reading this bubble, assuming the projections are correct?
Right. So as I mentioned to the board, when we went through this enrollment, just again to get us all on the same page, in the summer of 2021, we experienced a surge in enrollment that was unexpected. About 300 students registered that summer. That was about 3 times the heaviest summer that I've experienced since being here. So we've had steady enrollment growth in a county that is losing enrollment overall. So we are atypical for Nassau County in that we're a growing school district. So I certainly think that the attractiveness of the education program here has something to do with that. And I think it's an attractive community to live in for a lot of reasons. So we've seen a lot of residential construction as well taking place. And so there's not only the desire to live in the community, but the opportunity to do so because there's housing stock available. And it does seem, particularly in the wake of the pandemic and that huge housing surge that we saw 18 months ago, where the market was just extraordinarily volatile, lots of turnover in the marketplace that again brought new families into the community. So we have not experienced a surge like that in summer of 22 or summer now of 23, which is a relief to somebody who has to plan for enrollment. But we do see this upward trend, and that bunch of students that came into the district is going to age through the district. So I use the metaphor of a lump moving through the snake. This group will age out of elementary school, and they will age through middle school, and then they will age out of middle school and they'll age into the high school. So your analysis of when the peak of the bubble reaches each of those places is accurate, but there's a ramp up to the peak and there may be a ramp down from the peak. So we have to start putting room in place to accommodate the ramp, not just the peak. So with HBT, our projections have HBT essentially plateauing for the next several years and then coming down from that plateau just a little bit, nothing dramatic from an increase perspective or a decrease. So we would have to see a pretty significant break with the projections for HBT to start growing. So, and as you saw with the comparison between the projections and the current year number, they're like dead on. So I judge that to be unlikely, not impossible, but I just judge it to be unlikely. with Southwoods, the projection was for Southwoods to grow more than HBT, although Southwoods is right now a little bit below those projections. Not a lot, nothing that I would say is a trend break, but a little bit below. So I don't disbelieve the projection because we know those kids are already in elementary school and we know they are going to age. So it is just a question of how quickly they get to the middle school, and maybe the fact that it hasn't gone up quite as fast as was projected just means we have a little bit more time, maybe a year more time than we thought we might have had. But the bubble is going to be there because the bubble's already here in the elementary schools. And one thing that the enrollment projection firm does that is helpful is they geocode all of the addresses for the families of existing students. So their projections are able to account for the split at Robbins Lane, say, where some of the students go to HBT and others go to Southwoods, same with South Grove. So we're not just trending forward on a line, we're actually taking the existing families in the existing homes and using that to trend to which of the two middle schools they go to. So I still have confidence in the projection for Southwoods continuing to grow, and I feel we need to have a plan for how we accommodate that. And I certainly see the high school already growing. It's grown over 100 students since I arrived here, and it's going to continue to grow for the foreseeable future. And there, the growth is going to be in the neighborhood of about 10% of the students at the very peak. And so if there are roughly 100 classrooms of space at the high school, and you'd need roughly 10 more to accommodate that growth. So this project that I mentioned earlier and that you, the board saw, the E94 classroom, that's classroom number one of hopefully many to come. And we're right at the beginning of the bump. So maybe one classroom is enough for now, but soon we're going to need 2 and 3 and eventually 10.
Anyone else on enrollment? Mr. Ostrick, please.
So when I think about this from a big picture standpoint, there's really 2 dimensions of this problem that I think we're faced with as a board, faced with making decisions about, and they're both sort of future uncertain, right? The first is by 2030 or 2032, when our projections end, based on the recent increase in enrollment 2021, et cetera, that the so-called, we'll call it the bubble, right? The question is, do we then revert back to a lower level where the district was previously, or are we now sort of in an uptrend where we're making higher lows and higher highs over future uncertain? And the reason why this is important is that it affects whether or not we should be thinking about creating, I don't want to call it Band-Aid space, but 6 additional classrooms, 8 additional classrooms, whatever it is, or we have to think about fundamentally rethinking the space overall in the district and how it's being distributed. So that's, I think, a really important consideration as to whether or not we should be looking at how many of the buildings need to be upgraded, how and what sort of permanence that upgrade needs to take, and how extensive that upgrade needs to take. And that's the problem for the board, is that's obviously future uncertain, but I feel like we really need to come to some sort of consensus thought about that, because it impacts, I think, a significant number of the decisions that we have to make in terms of the investment that we're going to make in the space. There's a second dimension, but from my point of view, as I think about what I've seen just driving around, and you referenced this earlier, my sense is that the neighborhood construction lends, and the amount that I've seen lends itself to the idea that we're not likely to revert back to where we were 20 years ago, where the district was 1,000 kids smaller overall, right? 7,000 is approximately the peak. It's going to be that number for 5, 6, 7 years, according to the projections that we have. And then following that period, the question is, are we going back to 6,000, or are we more likely to stay around 6,500 plus? Again, these are future uncertain things, but my guess is, based on what I've seen, we're not likely to revert much lower back to earlier levels, which means that however we think we're going to address this, we need to make it more permanent and not sort of a Band-Aid, sort of individual move kids around between buildings, the cheapest alternative, right? We have enough space in the district for 7,000 kids. Every year we can just shuffle kids between buildings and that'll be the end of it. And we could survive, because if we were to drop another 1,000 kids, then it would be fine, right? No big deal. Because I think that's unlikely. I think we're more likely to have to go down the course where we're going to have to make significant investments in the infrastructure and capacity of the buildings. That's just my opinion, but I think it's something that we need to come to terms with and come to agreement about, because otherwise it's hard to frame the decisions that we have to make without it.
So I think you've captured the problem well and stated the problem well. With the enrollment projections that we have, if there's a plus or minus on them of, let's say, 2% in year one, the plus or minus is 4% in year two. And by the time we get to 2032, the plus or minus on them is probably 15%. So I don't think of anyone in my position who would look at a 10-year enrollment projection and be willing to bet the farm on it. So that's just the limitation of enrollment projections. And we've seen so much volatility for lots of exogenous reasons that have to do with the pandemic and the housing market changing and what's available, that I think you've stated it well. You have to plan for which unknown is the more likely of the two unknowns to come to pass. I would, in addition to the points you made, I would add, I think that as long as the educational program here remains as competitive and as attractive as it is, we will probably be different from the trend in Nassau County. If the trend in Nassau County continues to go down, I think we will not follow that trend because we are attractive for different reasons. The second thing that I would observe is, I'm thinking of new development on Jericho Turnpike, that when we did the enrollment projections, the demographers did not think it was likely that it would result in a lot of new students to the district. And so far it has not, which is consistent with their projections, but they're looking at that through the lens of 2022 market appetites. And the market appetite for that property and families may be different in 2029. And what I see there is very little yield in terms of students in the present, but the potential for yield at some point in the future if the appetite for housing changes. And certainly and I'm not making a political statement by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just observing the environment, and that there's an animated conversation going on in Albany right now about additional housing. And I have no idea where that conversation is going to land. But I don't think that we would be wise to ignore the fact that it's occurring.
And to follow up on that, I'm curious, do we have a data source where we can track additional addresses in the school district? In other words, it should seem obvious, right? More addresses means the higher probability of additional students. And the data that at least I had a number of years ago, the district had a database where you could look up every single person's address on the website to see where you were school zoned. I just wonder if we have access to that information overall, so we can see if there's been a significant change in the number of addresses in the district. To me, enrollment will follow addresses.
Yeah, I know that when we send out our newsletters, for example, we send it to every address in the Syosset Woodbury school district, and the post office figures that out for us. So if they're able to figure that out, we should be able to find out whether that number has changed, maybe sort out what's commercial from what's residential, but it seems to me like it should be doable and probably worthwhile.
Anyone else with questions on enrollment? Mr. Greco, please.
This ties into what Jack had mentioned, and I'm thinking about the bubble in terms of like the length of the bubble. And I know we talked about multiple times that the largest, I guess, variable in all of these projections is kindergarten, right? The number of kids starting in any given year. And that, if I remember correctly, the increase each year for each grade district-wide has been pretty consistent. So if fourth grade at any given time has X number of kids, it's X plus 3% the following year. the way I read that is kindergarten, every year's kindergarten enrollment will sort of dictate whether this is a 20-year bubble. And what Jack had mentioned earlier is a new plateau for our town, or if it's really going to be 1 or 2 years at these drastic numbers, and then we'll dip right back down. It's a long way of saying we've done a lot of studies, I think 4 now. This year's kindergarten numbers and next year's kindergarten numbers, can they just be plugged into whatever we have to determine the length of that bubble?
You would think so, but the answer is going to be no. We can and we do feed that data into the model. But what is an interesting phenomenon in Syosset is that the kindergarten class is only about half comprised of live births that occurred in Syosset. So that kindergarten class is already comprised of people who are moving into the district. And then the kindergarten class is roughly around 400 kids, and the graduating class is roughly around 550. So you would think that if you graduate 550 kids and you only enroll 400 kindergartners, the district would get smaller by 150 kids. But it doesn't. It actually gets bigger. How is that possible? We see a lot of enrollment growth in first and second and third and fourth grade. Significant 5% a year growth in the class. So that 400 student class in kindergarten is a 420 student class in first grade. The classes stop growing by the time they get to secondary school. And that's why those projections end up being a little less volatile. But through the course of elementary school, the classes keep growing as they age through. And it's, again, people moving into the district, kids moving into the district. So by the time you get to, if you want to project, is this year's kindergarten class going to yield 550 high school kids based on the 400 kids that are there right now? I could say if it follows the trends, I could tell you what it will be. But for 12 years from now, I wouldn't rely on those trends because so much is going to change through the next 5-6 years for that graduating class. So if this year's kindergartners are the class of, let's say it's 2035, I should have done the math. I don't know that we can look at that and predict with any accuracy that the class of 2035 is going to be 550 kids.
We can predict much better that the kindergarten to graduating 13 years later can be predicted easier than the number of kindergartners we're going to have in the next 2 or 3 years. Because that is very difficult to predict here because live births is not as much of a percentage of incoming kindergartners in our town. So what I'm trying to say is kindergarten enrollment this year, kindergarten enrollment next year, seems like if you feed that into the model, we can have a much better idea of whether this is going to be a 15-year-long bubble or if this is going to be a 2-year-long bubble.
So the nice thing about live birth data is I know what the live birth kindergartners are going to be for the next 4 years because they've already been born and I'm waiting for them to turn 5. So we have some good data, but again, that's only about half of that kindergarten pool. So at a technical level, what we do with the demographers is we say, okay, what percentage of the kindergarten class historically has been composed of live births from Syosset and transplants? And let's say it's 60-40 one year and it's 55-45 another year. We come up with an average over the last 3, 4, 5 years. And we say that's the average that we're going to apply to the 1-year-olds that we know live here, the 2-year-olds that we know live here, 3 and 4. So the next 4 years of kindergarten enrollments are based on known live births and the current trend for what proportion of that class constitutes live births. So again, there's no way of predicting who will or won't move into the district and whether they do or don't have a kindergartner when they do. But what we do have is a pretty stable trend, surprisingly, that has resulted in about 400 kindergartners in the district. And ironically, there was 1 year with very few live births, and that was the year that we had just a lot more people move into the district. The two compensated for each other, and we were right at 400 kindergartners. So if you go back and review the data, you'll see a lot of 400s 407, something like that. Again, I think that's probably as precise as we're going to be able to get. And I think the bigger factor is what will happen in the housing market and how the housing market develops here over the next dozen years or so.
Anyone else? Roman?
Just one more quick thing, which is, I think when we're talking about the expansion of facilities, I think it's important that we sort of tranche the elementary schools from the secondary schools, in the sense that if we are expecting certain regions in the interim period to be growing or to have plateaued at this higher level where they're approaching their peak enrollment, those buildings, as you identified, need sort of shorter term immediate attention. The question then becomes, when the next group of buildings, right? I want to have a consistent, what I'm trying to get to is, I want to have a consistent decision-making model where we decide how we're going to approach the elementary schools over time. So in other words, elementary schools are tight. We ought to pick some metric where we say, all right, this is what tight means. And therefore this means tight, and those schools need to have additional space added to them at some proportion that is consistent for a consistent set of rules of reasons, whether it's square foot per child or maximum capacity at 23 kids per class, whatever that number or metric is. I'd like to have a consistent set of rulemaking for why certain elementary schools get significant capital improvements and others may not, or maybe the alternative is the board needs to say, in the next 5 years, these two elementary schools, and then 5 years later, these two elementary schools, and maybe we need to go through the process of considering whether or not we should be upgrading all the elementary schools for a certain amount of capacity space. And to me, that we ought to review sort of the addresses again, in the sense that how many addresses are at each elementary school, right? Because ultimately that's the feeding ground for how many people can potentially be in any school at any given time. Right. So I don't know. I once looked at it, and I think if I remember right, AP Willits had the largest number of addresses in the district. And strangely, it has the fewest enrollment. I think it has the lowest enrollment hours. Anyway, I guess my point to you is I'd like to have a consistent set of rules when we're doing elementary school upgrades, so that when the next group comes up, if it does, or if it's not going to be database, it's just going to be every 2 years, every 5 years, we're going to redo 2 sets of elementary schools. I think the board needs to come to some, I don't know if it's a rule or a process by which that decision is going to get made over time. Otherwise, it may be that some elementary schools never place out because of increased capacity and they just don't get the upgrades that other ones do over time. And that's going to be separate from the secondary schools. That's a separate conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful way of looking at it. One insight that I had, and I wish I'd come to this insight earlier in my career, is that I'm reflecting on your ironic observation about Willits, or a counterintuitive, I guess is a better word, observation about Willits. What happens is a family moves into a home, the kids are young, they're part of the elementary school population. When the kids move into middle school, they don't vacate the home. The home remains there, but it stops being a factor in the elementary school. The kids then obviously go on to the high school. So when you have surges of kids in one school, and for a period of time that school feels very tight, it's a bubble going through that school. The bubble exits the school and then goes to middle school, but the houses don't turn over. So there's going to be a lull in the elementary side. It's not that the housing stock went away. It's just, it's being occupied by middle school families or high school families temporarily. And then at some point that housing stock will turn over and become elementary families again. So that I think contributes to sort of the cyclical nature of seeing some of the buildings rise and fall, but they're not all rising and falling together with one another. As a district as a whole, we've been growing, sure. But I think about Bayless being very tight a couple of years ago, but it crested and fell, and now those kids are aging into middle school. But the families remain in the Bayless catchment area. They're just not having younger kids anymore impact the elementary school. So I think as we think about a metric as you're suggesting, some homework that we would and should do as administration is to identify not only the number of addresses, but how many of those addresses are occupied by families, but those families may have older children as opposed to younger children.
Ms. Edmondson, please.
Just curious, but have we utilized anything from UPK to help with data and figuring things out, where people are coming from, where they're going, things like that?
Another great point. And the short answer is yes, but the UPK group is a subset of the kindergarten. So we're in the neighborhood of 300 kids in UPK, knowing that we're going to have probably a 400 kid kindergarten. What will happen over time, assuming that the state continues to give us the UPK grant and we continue to offer the program, is we will have a sense of typically, if we have 300 UPK kids, we usually get 400. So we know it's typically a 33% increase from UPK to kindergarten. And then if that ends up being a steady trend, we'll be able to bank on that trend in the future. And that will be another useful data point. But the first year, we had to turn people away from UPK because we didn't have enough seats. So this is our first year of having everybody who wanted a seat got a seat. So next year we'll have a second year, hopefully, of that. And then maybe by the third year, I'll feel like we have a trend, and that'll help us with future enrollment projections. For right now, what it's mostly helping us with is making sure that we have a better sense of the families that don't have any kids in school yet. Because now we're finding that new kindergartner a year earlier than we would have found the new kindergartner. So it's helping a little. It's not strong enough yet for projections, but it is helping us on the administrative side.
All right. Anyone else with questions on the second part, enrollment? All right. So now moving on to the next portion, which is the process portion of the discussion.
Oh, wait, so there's the process. I'm sorry. I thought we were moving. Sorry, I was just looking at this presentation. I did have something else that was related to this and
Enrollment?
enrollment. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Which
Mr.
is-
Ostrick, please.
When we're thinking about the secondary schools, which is slightly different from the elementary schools. So I was flipping through Niche the other day in preparation to think about this, and I was looking at school districts where the high school enrolls potentially 2,500 kids, and that list on Long Island is actually reasonably small number of districts. And when I think about most of sort of the districts that are of comparable size to us, most of those that we would think of as peers or competitors or however you want to phrase it, have 2 high schools and not just one. And as I think about the fact that the high school has moved, over the last decade to the number of students that are enrolled there, as we're thinking about investing in the secondary schools, I'd like to potentially reorient our thinking or expand our thinking to include options that don't just include making the high school a 2,500 student building, but rather expand the options to say maybe the secondary schools that we have need to be rethought or revamped, in the sense that maybe we need a second high school and the other buildings could be repurposed, or there's other space. At the end of the day, I wonder if there are larger considerations about whether or not we are servicing our students and families in the best possible way with a 2,500 student high school. I want to expand that conversation. I think part of the discussion that we've been having has been very linear in the sense that we should expand Southwoods, we should expand HBT, and we should expand the high school. Maybe we should be reorienting our thinking slightly differently to follow the models that most of the other districts on Long Island are following.
I think what I'd like to do is work with the high school administration, do a little bit of a deep dive into that question, and probably put together a list of pros and cons of splitting the high school population and what are the pros and cons of that, and having the high school population all together, and what are the pros and cons of that. So I think that will take multiple dimensions around sense of community, around academic offerings, and around extracurricular offerings. But I'm happy to put together an analysis for the board to reflect on.
Anyone else on the second part, enrollment?
I mean,
Alright.
it's not much of a discussion. Nobody else thinks anything about it.
Yeah, to Jeff's question. Does anyone have any feedback? Okay, Ms. Levington, please.
I think starting with feedback from our high school experts is a great starting point. Let's start there. And then we'll take it from there. I think this is quite an undertaking to even consider conceptually.
Anyone, Ms. Goshia, please?
As far as Jack's question, or suggestion, my first thought is, do we have the physical space anywhere in the district to build a facility for a high school? Because if we don't, then I think trying to get information from administration and whatnot would be a little bit of a waste of time. If we don't have the physical space to do it, then I think it's not a point to look at. I think that would be the first question is, would we have the space to build another facility? And then what would the cost be? Because now you have two sets of administration, teachers, like Dr. Rogers says, you have to offer the programs. It's much more than just the facility. I know high schools, for argument's sake, that have 4,000 kids in a building that are private. So I don't know so much if the number is affecting the quality of education, because we've been doing really well so far. So my first question would be, do we have the space to do that? And then go from there with the thought process.
Anyone else with the feedback?
Sure. I mean, I don't intuitively know the answer to that, but we have multiple buildings that are serving as middle schools. Maybe we should flip them to be high schools and have this high school be a middle school. I mean, or maybe high school could be 3 grades. I'm just saying, let's consider a wider variety of options instead of just going in a linear fashion into bigger and bigger buildings. I'd like to be creative with the opportunity to think strategically. If we're going to be investing big dollars into a significant facilities upgrade, I'd like to be more comprehensive in our thought process about what we're trying to accomplish, other than keep going in a straight line. It can't be an accident that the vast majority of school districts on Long Island have less than 1,500 kids. Even in districts that have the same numbers as us, they have multiple high schools. It might be a coincidence that everyone evolved that way, but that seems unlikely. There must be, in my opinion, something to it that the model exists the vast majority of the cases that way. I think we should explore it.
Ms. Abramson, please.
I just want to understand what you're trying to say, because I heard you say flipping the middle schools and the high school. Did you say that?
I guess what I'm saying is, I'm not the how guy, I'm the why guy, right? So I don't want to propose the solution. I want to consider the question.
Okay. My first thought is I went where Lisa and Anna went, which is there's not the physical space, the staffing, and understanding that even if we were to flip things, I mean, it's like there's the track and the fields, it's a lot. I think the districts that did have it had it they had the buildings available, or they merged districts that were once singular and became bigger. I don't know, and a lot of them function rather separately, versus under one. I think also that a lot of our students, that we would have to talk to them too, because I think they kind of thrive on the fact that they all come together and they like that. They like meeting the new kids and coming together with kids that have similar interests from both sides. And I don't know that they would be amenable to that either. Just something else to think about in the grand scheme of thinking about things, is that a lot of kids wait to be with their friends from the other side of town in the way we've constructed it right now.
Mr. Greco, please.
So Dr. Rogers, in response to Jack, you'd mentioned you'd put together a list of pros and cons, and I'm sure you're taking notes of what Lisa and Lynn said for the con list. I'm wondering, what kind of undertaking would it be to put, that's a significant analysis, but I don't know if we could really have this discussion much without knowing not only the pros and cons, but a better understanding of why we may be in the minority of large school districts with only one high school. But it's an interesting point. I never thought about it. I came from a district that had 2 high schools that when I was there converted to 1 high school. I don't remember the reason. So I'd be interested in knowing the answer to that question as well as the pros and cons.
Anyone else with any inputs? No? Okay.
So just to answer Mr. Greco's question and sort of weigh in, whether the list of pros and cons is a big or small undertaking, if it's something the board needs to think about this more, we will undertake the undertaking. I do think that what you will discover if you really burrow into the history of school districts on Long Island is what Ms. Abramson said, is a lot of the infrastructure is dictated by how school districts merged over time and what the existing infrastructure was. So because I'm a history buff in exactly this area, New York State had 10,000 school districts at one point, and obviously slowly whittled that away through a process of consolidation. So from 10,000 school districts at the turn of the century now have about 700 school districts. On Long Island, there hasn't been a school district merger since about 25 years ago. And the last one before that was in the 1950s. So the regions put together something called a master plan. And the master plan had an outline of all the districts that the regents suggested should reorganize for size sake. And the last district on their plan for Long Island to reorganize was Oyster Bay School District and East Norwich. They merged in 1954. So my point in all of this being that I don't think that the structure, the high school structure that school districts have inherited is the product of deep thought. I'm sure that a lot of deep thought has gone into working with the infrastructure that they have, but I don't think that anyone has built a modern educational program and built a modern infrastructure simultaneously since Eastport South Manor built their high school. I think that's the last new high school that's been built on Long Island. All of which is to say, there are likely advantages of having 2 schools, and there are likely disadvantages of having 2 schools. And you're weighing some one-time costs, some upfront costs of investing in facilities against some long-term recurring operating costs. And so I see a cost dimension to this, and I see, again, programmatic dimension, social dimension, community dimension. And we can certainly comb through this, and I would love to get the reactions from the secondary principals to these ideas and see what they see as the pros and cons, and then share that with the board. And I think that would inform your discussion further.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Rogers. Please let us know the pros and cons. Thank you. All right, so we're moving on to the last part, which is the process part of the constructions. Anyone else with questions on the last part? The process? Looks like we're all good with the last part. All right, so so we definitely had a lot of conversations tonight, and I know Dr. Rogers is taking a lot of notes. And then I'm sure there will be future questions, and then we're also looking forward to the August 28th meeting where we'll have more information from the architect, and we'll take it from there. And then in the meantime, if the public or the board has any questions, please feel free to email the board. And this is it. May I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Okay. Ryan and Anna, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your summer. See you August 28th. Thank you.